I let you to introduce yourself to the Hungarian viewers. In a few words, I know I've watched every single video you ever made, so I know you don't like to talk about yourself, but within a few words, if you can just tell a few sentences about yourself, about your background, what's your story?
My story is very long and twisted and probably not super interesting or relevant. But the short answer is the path I wound up taking through life basically immersed me in bodybuilding, powerlifting, strength training, and high-level athletics. I started weight training at age 10 in an organized fashion in commercial gyms. I actually began exercising and training, if you will, prior to that even. Because of my enthusiasm, I was I was able to basically worm my way into a very elite crowd of individuals, partly because I had some native skill and I had a bit of, youthful prodigy, but quite honestly, mostly just, I think, because of my relentless enthusiasm and dogmatic approach. I was able to rub shoulders with people like Tom Potts, Fred Hatfield, Tom Dieters, a lot of names that probably lost to time, but people of essentially the 80s that were very, very influential in the development of high-level athletics. Again, because of my athletic acumen and then also my relentless pursuit of knowledge to make myself better. And that really is the key. It was mostly driven to make myself better as an athlete. Little did I know, little did I realize that my real gift, if I have such a thing as a gift, my real gift was actually relaying that information, not really utilizing it as my own, personal modality for athletic excellence, which I think I accomplished maybe to a small degree. But because of that, and because of the high level of people that I was surrounded with, the pursuit of knowledge, both outside of the classroom and inside of the classroom, was very, very heavily reinforced. And because of that, I pursued a degree in biology, a minor in chemistry. That led me to university, obviously. And at university is basically where things opened up for me, not so much because of the intellectual prowess, not because of the academic prowess. As a matter of fact, I found that rather disappointing. But what it did open to me was access to both tools and individuals. It opened the door to national and world caliber track athletes, national and world caliber team sports. It opened the door to an entire laboratory, a human performance laboratory. And so that was really where I got to kind of find my way in terms of I really should be coaching. I really should be. And I've often thought of myself very, very much after the fact as a conduit, in that because I was an athlete and because I was a serviceable academic, I actually filled the role of being able to talk to athletes in a language that they would understand, and then simultaneously be able to turn my head and talk to and communicate with academics in a language that they could understand, and hence transmit the information left to right, which gave me a very, very unique value in a lot of those situations. And simply that start is how I got to where I am. I started working with high-level track and field athletes at the university, and that just kept growing into, and then it became boxers, and then it was actually before the days of mixed martial arts, but then mixed martial artists, and then bodybuilders and powerlifters, and I myself was a powerlifter, so that kept that doorway open, and then the advent of strongman, and I just kind of weaved my way through the world of sports performance. And just to be clear, and just to not sweep anything under the rug, most of that was largely the fact that I was knowledgeable in and willing to speak on the topic of drugs. That was probably what differentiated me from most. And again, I also want to be very clear. It's not that I singularly possess that knowledge, because that's not the case at all. But I was either dumb enough or brave enough, or perhaps both, to speak about it, which made me very unique, particularly in the late 80s, early 90s, when no one would do that.
And as we know that coaching involves a lot of different stuff, from the diet to the drugs to the workout plans and all the stuff. What would you say, which one of these is your expertise? What's your favorite part of being a coach?
That's actually a really difficult question, because in a lot of ways, one, depends on the individual. Two, depends on the individual sport. There are some sports that I just find silly and I don't enjoy working with. I'm not going to lie and say otherwise. And then lastly, it to a degree just kind of just depends. There are people out there that are so gifted, they really only need a few little kernels of truth and knowledge to excel. There are other people out there that are so genetically or potentially lacking that basically science and drugs and behaviors are the only thing to prop up their performance. So it's really it really comes down to who and what. I would say, and I don't mean to be silly, but as far as holding my attention, what's interesting to me is more the individual than the actual, oh, it's drugs, or oh, it's nutrition, or whatever. It's the actual individual. And that's one of the reasons why I'm not probably more famous than I am, because I turn away an awful lot of potential clients. I turn away probably, I'm sure I'm not exaggerating to say, a full 50%, maybe more. I just simply choose not to work with them because they personally just don't fucking interest me. And I'm not going to do that.
So as you probably know, that you were known as a drug guy. You are the typical drug experts. That's how people probably know you. But before we get into that stuff, unfortunately, we need to talk about the diets first, the basic stuff, because as I told you before the recording, that my goal is with this video is basically to spread some basic knowledge in Hungary, because I feel like Hungary is a good, I don't know, 20, 30 years behind the real science. And as I told you, very, very basic stuff like carbs make you fat, fructose make you fat, you need 500 grams of protein, stuff like that. This is the common knowledge in Hungary. And I want to basically destroy all this with this video because obviously when I say the same things, it's just not the same. It has to come from you. So I know it's probably a little offensive for you to ask this, but if you can talk a little bit about carbohydrates in general, what's the truth behind that? What's the purpose of that? Do we need money carbs? Do we need carbs at all? Is it essential for life? What's to use the carbs in bodybuilding? So carbs in general.
Well, it's funny because that's a really difficult question to actually frame. You said, for instance, are carbs necessary or are they necessary for life? And the answer is actually strangely no. However, the reason for that no is that they're actually so essential that the body has multiple ways of faking it, in that it's kind of probably a bad example, probably a very politically incorrect and bad example. But the example I often use is during World War II, when America joined World War II, the very first thing we did strategically was bomb the oil fields of Ploiești, Romania. And the thinking was, if we starved Germany of oil, they would not be able to continue fighting because they would have no fuel. Suspiciously similar to the concept of carbohydrates. If we starve them of carbohydrates, they would have no energy to perform. However, being the industrious Prussian maniacs that they were, they simply engaged in making synthetic fuels out of shale and coal and all the other resources that they actually had. That's exactly what the human body does. If you starve it of carbohydrates, it just simply goes through a bunch of chemical hoops and jumps through these series of hoops to just make artificial carbohydrates that everyone knows as ketones. A ketogenic diet is simply the long way around for your body to make the very carbohydrates that you're not eating. Now, a little off topic, but the quote benefit of that, if there is such a thing, is that because it's a complicated, convoluted process, it's not as efficient. So if you eat 1,000 calories of protein, your body is only able to get about 700 calories of usable carbohydrate-like energy. So there's a 30% loss in the process. Therefore, you get to eat more food or have a larger deficit. So there's a certain amount of validity, perhaps, to the concept of a ketogenic diet. But the part that is lost on people is it's not that carbohydrates are inconsequential. It's that they're so consequential that your body will waste 30% of its net energy just to fucking make them. That's the part that people don't understand. So this idea that no amount of carbohydrates are requisite for life, it's true only because your body will go to any lengths to make them. So again, that comes down to basically a word salad of how do you want to define necessary. In my view, that makes them amazingly, almost fundamentally necessary. Many other people would say, no, they're utterly inconsequential because your body can make them ad hoc. Both views are in a sense correct. However, my argument is and always will be basically predicated on this. One, if you own a machine, a complicated machine, like say an automobile or an airplane or any complicated machine, the less you stress it, the longer it will last. The less you drive your car, or the less aggressively you drive your car, the longer it will last. Every granny has an automobile that basically looks like and drives like new because they don't use it much. The other side of the coin, every young kid that buys a junker, they run the dirt out of it and then it dies. So in a simple sense, taking the less complicated metabolic pathway is going to reduce wear and tear. That's fundamental. The second part is things move subtly into my realm of hormones at that point. What I'm about to say isn't perfectly accurate, but in a general sense it is. There are 3 macronutrients: carbohydrates, protein, and fat. That part's accurate. In a general sense, if you were to eat a large bolus of fat, a large bolus of protein, or a large bolus of carbohydrates in isolation, the fat will do essentially nothing hormonally. You'll eat it, it will be distributed as energy, end of story. Protein, that's mostly true. There's actually a little bit of insulin response to leucine and some other amino acids, but in a general sense, protein does nothing hormonally. However, carbohydrates cause a very significant measurable response in hormones, predominantly insulin, but not exclusively. Okay, so now we've got a situation where of the 3 things you can eat, one of them generates a hormonal response, the other 2 do not. That's significant. Big light bulb has gone off. So now let's look at insulin. Is it strange that athletes the world around in multiple sport disciplines are using exogenous insulin for athletic excellence? We've got a food that generates a response in the very thing that people are breaking the law and risking their health to create. Once again, big light bulb has gone off. That's interesting. Now, insulin over the years has been demonized and talked about, and to some degree, partly accurately, partly correctly, but in a very general sense, insulin is, if not anabolic, and I would dare say yes, anabolic, it is certainly anti-catabolic. So again, we could just look up that word, like that's an interesting word. Let's break the dictionary open and look that up. Anabolic, that which makes larger. Well, I'm a bodybuilder and I want to be larger, so let's put that in the win column. Anti-catabolic, that which reduces breakdown. Well, I don't really want to break down, so let's also put that in a win column. So we've got a food that magically supplies us with this positive hormonal response. Now, it is also true that insulin will potentiate the anabolic effects of fat tissue. That is accurate. However, it's also incredibly childlike, incredibly simplified, and also not super relevant in that, first and foremost, fat, if you eat it, does not require any mediation to enter fat cells. Literally, if you eat fat, it circulates in the blood. If it finds a fat cell, it literally just enters the fat cell with no resistance. Okay? No insulin's required, no other hormone is required. Fat, if you put 2 drops of fat on a plate and just jiggle them until they touch, they just join and make one fat globule. That is how simply and easily fat will enter fat. So this idea that insulin's requisite for storing fat, that's just wrong. Okay. They're just wrong in every way. Secondly, we have this concept called insulin sensitivity. And insulin sensitivity is a very giant and complex topic that basically can be boiled down to what tissue is most receptive to the insulin. And we have multiple, and again, as a bodybuilder, as a powerlifter, whatever, we think of one tissue. We think of muscle. That's the only thing we think of. But the reality is we have multiple tissues. We have organs like, say, the liver. We have adipose, fat tissue. We have muscle tissue. We have brain and all sorts of other organ tissues. So what controls insulin sensitivity largely? The answer to that is behavior. Behavior controls insulin sensitivity for the most part, assuming you don't have a metabolic condition or any of the many things. But comically, even if you had a metabolic condition like, say, laziness or obesity or both, that's actually a behavior. So the reality is it's behavior. So if you're going to the gym, lifting weights, creating muscle damage, creating energy deficits within muscle cells start to get more and more receptive to potential energy because they're lacking it, as does the liver. And coincidentally, if you have all of these assorted tissues and muscle and liver are getting more and more receptive, fat is actually getting less receptive because the body ultimately operates on a semblance of balance. So the way you make insulin less fat retentive is you simply exercise, which is kind of almost a de facto obvious in the conversation of a bodybuilder or an athlete. Notice I separated those. I want to offend people, but that's kind of my job, is to offend people. Bodybuilding, by the way, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, children of all ages, not a sport. It is not a sport. There's no sporting involved. At best, it's a fucking pageant. I'm not besmirching it. I love bodybuilding. It's truly one of my original joys in life. But let's be honest. It's not an athletic event. It's a pageant at best. So anyway, that portion's over. So again, carbohydrates are, you could argue, not essential for life. But if you took that argument to its more reasonable long-term conclusion, it's that they're actually so essential for life that your body has multiple pathways to making them or faking them, which is essentially the same thing. So then my second point is that carbohydrates do in fact cause an insulin response, and insulin is anabolic and or catabolic. My argument will be, and I think I shudder to say always will be, because I am open to change, but I think this portion of my song and dance is sufficiently grounded in both science and repetitive proof or repetitive verification that I don't think I'll back off of this. So my argument would be consume the correct or requisite amount of fat and protein, which we can talk about in a minute, and then all of one's remaining energy requirements simply come from carbohydrates because they're cheap, they're accessible, they're easily digestible, and they create this magical insulin environment which seems to be pretty positive toward the whole concept of growth. And we haven't even got into how insulin's synergistic with growth hormone and other variables. Also, if you get into, this is very deep, but even if you get into the actual presence of testosterone and or anabolic steroids, there's something called binding proteins, which mediate the action of anabolic steroids. A higher insulin environment suppresses binding proteins, which then allows more of that anabolic drug to perform its anabolic goodness. So once again, there's almost no downside to carbohydrates. They're cheap, they're easy, they're accessible, and they're anabolic. What more do you want? I'm a little confused at that point. So now the real rub in the logical arrangement here is figuring out what is the correct amount of fat and protein. That's actually the much more intellectual portion of the conversation, other than just prioritizing, and the priority is carbohydrates, then protein, and lastly fats. And yes, I did say lastly fats. I know people love to love fats. Because the word essential has been tied to some of them. There's essential fats, and there are, and it's true, and I would never argue to the other. However, the difference between something being essential and the essential amount being very small is a subtle but very important part of the language.
So yes, there is the amount we need.
Yes, there is an essential amount. However, that amount is really small. Really small. It doesn't make it less essential, and it doesn't mean that if you skipped over it altogether, you wouldn't have horrific health problems. That's accurate. But it also means that the entire essential amount will fit on a fucking tablespoon. Like, in total. Okay, that's important. So starting at the bottom, fats are basically the topic that everyone loves to dislike my general opinions. There are essential fatty acids. That amount is very, very small.